Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. I'm here at SpaceX's brand new launch facility in Boca Chica, Texas, to check out the holy grail of rocket engines, and that's SpaceX's upcoming Raptor engine. An engine like this has never actually been used on a rocket before. Now, this is a methane-powered, full-flow, staged combustion cycle engine. Talking about a rocket engine that's this complex can be really intimidating. And in order to put it into context against other engines and other engine cycles, we're going to do a full comparison of the Raptor engine versus a bunch of other engines, including SpaceX's current workhorse, the Merlin engine, against the RS-25, the Space Shuttle main engine, the F1 engine that powered the Saturn V, the RD-180, and Blue Origin's BE-4 that also runs on methane. And as if the full-flow staged combustion cycle wasn't enough, SpaceX is also doing something else unique. They're powering that thing with liquid methane, and that's something that's actually never been done on an orbital-class rocket. So we're going to take a look at the characteristics of methane and see if we can figure out why SpaceX chose methane instead of any other common propellant. Now, this engine isn't really the best at anything. It's not the most powerful. It's not the highest thrust to weight ratio of any engine. It's not even the most efficient, but it does a lot of things really, really well. So by the end of this video, hopefully we'll have all the context to understand why the Raptor engine is special, how it compares to other rockets, why it's using liquid methane, and then hopefully we'll know if it really is the king of rocket engines. Let's get started.
3, 2, 1, That's one small step for man. Contact with a test one.
Now, in case you didn't notice when you clicked on this video, this is a very, very long video. Sorry, not sorry. But if you're anything like me, you keep hearing a lot of hype about the Raptor engine and you want to appreciate it, but you don't even know where to start. Well, I've spent quite a while really studying up on the subject so I can lay down a good foundation in order to help us really, truly, fully appreciate the Raptor engine. Well, and quite frankly, all rocket engines. And if you're anything like me, maybe you've stared at diagrams like this, or like this, or like this one, for hours until you feel like your head's going to explode. So in order to avoid that, I've actually whipped up some really simple versions of rocket engine cycles for all of us to enjoy, which will hopefully help us grasp these crazy concepts. But in case this isn't your first rodeo, here's the timestamps if you want to jump to a certain section. There's also links in the description to each section, as well as an article version of this entire video at my website, everydayastronaut.com, in case you want to study some of the numbers a little more in depth or see sources of some of the material. Now, we're going to start off with a super quick physics lesson, but bear with me. We're going to dive in and get plenty of nitty-gritty details. Okay, so let's start off with this. Rockets are basically just propellant with some skin around it to keep it in place, and they have a thing on the back that can throw said propellant really, really fast. And to way oversimplify it even more, the faster you can throw that propellant, the better. Now, the easiest way to do this is by storing all the propellant in your tanks under really high pressure. Then put a valve on one end of the tank and a propelling nozzle that accelerates the propellant into workable thrust. Done. No crazy pumps or complicated systems, just open a valve and let her rip. This is called a pressure-fed rocket engine, and there's a few main types: cold gas, monoprop, and bipropellant pressure-fed engines. You'll often find these used in reaction control systems because they're simple, reliable, and they react quickly. But pressure-fed engines have one big limiting factor. Pressure always flows from high to low, so the engine can never be higher pressure than the propellant tanks. In order to store propellant under high pressure, your tanks will need to be strong and therefore thicker and thicker and heavier. Look at composite overwrapped pressure vessels, or COPVs. They're capable of storing gases at almost 10,000 psi or 700 bar. And despite this, there's still a limited amount of propellant and pressure they can store. And this does not scale up very well when you're trying to deliver a payload to orbit. So smart rocket scientists quickly realized in order to make the rocket as lightweight as possible, there's really only one thing they could do: increase the enthalpy. That would be a great metal band name. You're welcome, Internet. Enthalpy is basically the relationship between volume, pressure, and temperature. A higher pressure and temperature inside the combustion chamber equals higher efficiency, and more mass shoved through the rocket engine equals more thrust. So in order to shove more propellant into the engine, you could either increase the pressure in the tanks, or just shoot the propellant into the combustion chamber with a really high-powered pump. The second option sounds like a pretty good idea. But pumps moving hundreds of liters of fuel per second require a lot And boy, do I mean a lot of energy to power them. So what if you took a tiny rocket engine and aimed it right at a turbine to spin it up really, really fast? You could exchange some of the rocket propellant's chemical energy for kinetic energy, which could then be used to spin these powerful pumps. Welcome to turbopumps and the staged combustion cycle. But you've still got some limiting factors here, like how high pressure always wants to go to low pressure and how heat has that habit of melting stuff. So you've got to keep all these things in check while trying to squeeze every bit of power out of your engine. Now, there's actually a lot of different variations of the cycles that we could talk about, but I'm going to stick with the three most common, or at least the three that matter the most when putting the Raptor into context. We have the gas generator cycle, the partial flow staged combustion cycle, and lastly, we'll look at the full flow staged combustion cycle. And perhaps in a future video, I'll try and do a full rundown of all liquid-fueled rocket engines, including fun new alternatives like the electric pump-fed engines seen on Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. So let's start with the gas generator cycle known as the open cycle. This is probably one of the most common types of liquid-fueled rocket engine used on orbital rockets. It's definitely more complicated than a pressure-fed system, but it's fairly simple, well, at least compared to their closed cycle counterparts. Now, I'm gonna way oversimplify this so it's as easy to grasp as humanly possible. In real life, there's literally dozens of valves, a hive of wires, and extra tiny little pipes everywhere, helium to back pressure the tanks, fuel flowing through the nozzle and the combustion chamber to cool it, and there's an ignition source for the preburner and the combustion chamber. But again, for the purpose of making this as simple and as digestible as possible, just know there's a lot of stuff missing from these diagrams. But for now, we're just going to focus on the flow of these engines so we can grasp that concept first. The gas generator cycle works by pumping the fuel and oxidizer into the combustion chamber using a turbopump. The turbopump has a few main parts: a mini rocket engine called the preburner, a turbine connected to a shaft, and then a pump or two that push propellant into the combustion chamber. Now, you might hear the turbopump assembly called the power pack because it really is what powers the engine. In the open cycle system, the spent propellant from the preburner is simply dumped overboard and does not contribute any significant thrust. This makes it less efficient since the fuel and oxidizer used to spin the pumps is basically wasted. Now, the funny thing about a turbopump is that it kind of has a chicken and egg syndrome situation that makes it pretty difficult to start up, since the preburner that powers the turbopump needs high pressure fuel and oxidizer to operate. So the preburner requires the turbopumps to spin before it can get up to full operational pressure itself, but the turbopumps need the preburner to fire in order to spin the turbopumps, but the preburner needs the turbopumps to... Yeah. You can see where this is going. This makes starting a gas generator pretty tricky. There's a few ways to do this, but we don't need to get into all that in this video. That sounds like a fun topic for future videos though. So back to the turbopumps. Remember, pressure always flows from high to low. So the turbopumps need to be a higher pressure than the chamber pressure, and this means the inlets leading to the preburner is actually the highest pressure point in the entire rocket engine. Everything else downstream is lower pressure. But notice something here. Take a look at SpaceX's Merlin engine, which runs on RP-1 or Rocket Propellant 1 and liquid oxygen. Notice how black the smoke is coming out of the preburner exhaust. Why would it be so sooty compared to the main combustion chamber, which leaves almost no visible exhaust? Well, that's because rocket propellant can get super hot, like thousands and thousands of degrees Celsius. So to make sure the temperature isn't so hot that it melts the turbine and the entire turbopump assembly, they need to make sure it's cool enough to continually operate. Running at the perfect fuel and oxidizer ratio is the most efficient and releases the most energy, but it also produces a crazy amount of heat. So in order to keep the temperatures low, you can run the preburner at a less than optimal ratio. So either too much fuel, known as fuel rich, or too much oxidizer, or oxygen rich. Running an RP-1 engine fuel rich means you'll see some unburnt fuel appearing as dark clouds of soot. The highly pressurized unburnt carbon molecules bond and form polymers, which is a process known as coking. This soot starts to stick to everything it touches and can block injectors, or even do damage to the turbine itself. So what if you didn't want to waste all that highly pressurized propellant? I mean, after all, since it's running cooler by being fuel rich, doesn't that mean there's a bunch of unburned fuel literally being wasted? What if you could just pipe that hot exhaust gas and put it into the combustion chamber? Huh? Welcome to the closed cycle. The closed cycle or staged combustion cycle increases engine efficiency by using what would normally be lost exhaust and connects it to the combustion chamber to help increase pressure and also increase efficiency. So let's take the Merlin engine and try closing the loop. Let's take the exhaust and just pipe it straight into the combustion chamber. Uh-oh. Oh no! We just put a bunch of soot and clogged all the injectors. You do not go to space today, my friend. But there's a few solutions to this problem, so let's see how the Soviets solved it. The first operational closed cycle engine they made was the NK-15, designed for their N-1 moon rocket. They later upgraded it to the NK-33, and then many versions from there stemmed out, including the RD-180, which is what is used on the Atlas V today. Since the NK-15 and NK-33 runs on RP1 like the Merlin, you can't run your preburners fuel-rich because of the coking problem. So if you want to create a closed cycle engine with RP1, the answer is running the preburner oxygen-rich. Easy as that, right? Well, now you're blasting superheated, highly pressurized gaseous oxygen, which will turn just about anything into soup, right at your precision machined, crazy low tolerance turbine blade. Doing so is actually considered impossible by the United States, and they basically gave up on trying. They didn't think a metal alloy existed that could withstand these crazy, crazy conditions. And they didn't believe the Soviets had made such an efficient and powerful RP-1 powered engine until after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the US engineers got to see them and test them out firsthand. But the Soviets had indeed worked their butts off, and they had made a special alloy that can magically, with science, withstand the crazy conditions of an oxygen-rich preburner. With a closed cycle engine, you don't just use some fuel and some oxidizer and burn that in the preburner to spin the turbine, you actually shoot all of the rich propellant through the turbine. So with an oxygen-rich cycle, all of the oxygen actually goes through the preburner, and just the right amount of fuel goes to the preburner to give the turbine the right amount of energy to spin the pumps fast enough to get the right amount of pressure for the preburner and the combustion chamber to make the right amount of power to shoot the thing into space. It's just crazy. So back to this oxygen-rich preburner. That now hot gaseous oxygen is forced into the combustion chamber where it meets liquid fuel. They meet and go boom, and we get a nice, clean, and efficient burn without really wasting any propellant. But still, like all engines, the chamber pressure cannot be higher than the pump pressure, so the pumps actually have a lot of weight on their tiny little metal shoulders. Now, if you're sitting there thinking that the United States just sat back and let the Soviets have all the closed cycle glory, you'd be wrong. It took the United States a little bit longer, but they eventually figured out a closed cycle engine. But it was very different from the oxygen-rich cycle. The United States pursued a closed-loop cycle, but they went with a fuel-rich preburner. But wait, we just learned that fuel-rich preburners' exhaust is so sooty that it pretty much ruins anything, right? Well, sure, if you're using RP1 or any other carbon-heavy fuel, that's definitely going to be the outcome. So the United States went with a different fuel, hydrogen. Okay, so now we've avoided the problem of blasting crazy hot, high-pressure oxygen at anything dear and precious. But now we've opened up a new can of worms. Hydrogen is significantly less dense than RP1 or liquid oxygen. It's so much less dense, it takes a huge and really complex turbopump to flow the right amount of hydrogen into the combustion chamber. Since RP1 and LOX are relatively similar in density and in ratios, they can be run on a single shaft using a single preburner. Because of this, the engineers at Rocketdyne pursued an engine known as the RS-25, which would go on to power the space shuttle. They realized that because of the large difference between the pumps, they might as well have two different preburners, one for the hydrogen pump and one for the oxygen pump. So that's what they did. But having two separate shafts created another new problem. Now engineers were putting high pressure, hot gaseous hydrogen on the same shaft right next door to the liquid oxygen pump. If some of that hydrogen would leak out of the preburner, it would start a fire in the LOX pump, which is catastrophically bad. Hydrogen is also very hard to contain because it's so not dense, or undense, lightweight. It likes to sneak through cracks and get out anywhere it can. So engineers had to make an elaborate seal to keep the hot hydrogen from sneaking out. The seal required for this is called a purge seal, and it's actually pressurized by helium, so that it's the highest point of pressure. So if the seal leaks, it just leaks inert helium. It's genius. But take a look at how different the LOX turbopump and the hydrogen turbopump seals look. You can tell how much more engineering time and effort had to go into the hydrogen seals. I mean, the people that think of this stuff are nuts. The RS-25 is still considered to be about the best engine ever made, with a fairly high thrust-to-weight ratio and unmatched efficiency. Okay, so now that we've talked all about the dual-burner, fuel-rich RS-25 engine, here's a simplified diagram of that. Now, I didn't bother making the fuel pumps different sizes, and I just want to focus on the flow here so that we make that nice and simple. But do note, both pre-burners of the RS-25 run fuel-rich. So although they might look the same in this diagram, they power different pumps. I'll just let this run here for a few seconds so you can study it for a bit. And don't worry, once we're done explaining all of them, we'll put all of them up on screen so you can watch them all run together. So the closed cycle improves the overall performance of the engine and is highly advantageous. So how can it get any better than this? We're finally ready to talk about the full flow stage combustion cycle, which basically just combines the two cycle methods we just talked about. With the full flow stage combustion cycle, you take two pre-burners, one that runs fuel rich and one that runs oxygen rich. The fuel rich pre-burners powers the fuel pump and the oxygen rich pre-burner powers the LOX pump. This means the full flow stage combustion cycle needs to tackle the oxygen rich problems, which again is solved by developing very strong metal alloys. So SpaceX developed their own super alloys in-house that they named SX500. According to Elon Musk, it's capable of over 800 bar of hot oxygen-rich gas. That may have been one of the biggest hurdles in developing the Raptor engine. Luckily, the fuel-rich side only pumps fuel, so if some of that hot fuel leaks through the seal on the shaft, it just comes in contact with more fuel, which is kind of no big deal. So no need for one of those really elaborate seals. Full flow likely wouldn't work with RP1 due to the coking problems with a fuel-rich pre-burner. But other fuels are still valid to use this design. But more on that in a minute. The advantage of this system is that since both the fuel and the oxidizer arrive in the combustion chamber as a hot gas, there's better combustion and hotter temperatures can be achieved. There's also less of a need for that crazy sealing system as we mentioned earlier. And that's definitely a good thing when you plan to reuse your engine over and over with little to no refurbishment between flights. And lastly, because there's an inherent increase in mass flow, or how quickly all the propellant is shooting into the pre-burner, the turbines can run cooler and at lower pressures because the ratio of fuel and oxidizer needed to spin the turbopumps is much lower. And think of it this way. In an open cycle, you only want to use as little fuel and oxidizer as possible in the pre-burner since it's all wasted. And you want it to be as hot as withstandable to make it more efficient. But with the full flow cycle, all of the fuel and all of the oxidizer goes through the pre-burners, so you can burn just exactly as much propellant as necessary to power the turbopumps. But the cool thing is, your fuel to oxidizer ratios will be so crazy fuel rich and crazy oxygen rich that the temperatures at the turbines will be much lower, and this means longer lifespans for the turbopump assembly. It also means more combustion happens in the combustion chamber and less in the pre-burner. Now here's the crazy part. Only 3 engines have demonstrated the full flow stage combustion cycle. Ever. In the 60s, the Soviets developed an engine called the RD-270, which never flew, and in the early 2000s, Aerojet and Rocketdyne worked on an integrated powerhead demonstrator called, wait for it, the Integrated Powerhead Demonstrator, which, again, never made it past the test stand. And the third attempt at developing a full flow stage combustion cycle engine is SpaceX's Raptor engine. Ta-da! That's right. The Raptor engine is only the 3rd attempt at making this crazy type of engine. It's the first to ever do any type of work and leave a test stand. And fingers crossed, it'll be the first full flow stage combustion cycle engine to reach orbit. Well, actually, just about anything this engine does will be a first. This means SpaceX had to tackle some crazy problems. I mean, not only that same problem that plagues oxidizer-rich cycles, like having to have a really strong metal alloy, they also had to learn how to control, 2 different pre-burners and 2 different cycles to create the highest pressures of any chamber pressure ever. They just beat the RD-180's record of about 265 bar when they hit 270 bar, and they're not even done. They're hoping for 300 bar inside the combustion chamber. That's nuts, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But before we move on, now that we've done a rundown on all these engine cycle types, let's put them all up on screen and let them run for a bit so you can watch each one and compare them side by side. I know for myself, it helps a lot to see them all together on the same screen at the same time. Since the Raptor engine can't run a fuel-rich preburner using RP1, you'd think the next most logical choice would be hydrogen. Well, SpaceX didn't opt for either RP1 or hydrogen, they went with liquid methane. So now we finally have another topic to touch on. Why did SpaceX choose liquid methane for the Raptor engine? What are the qualities that make it advantageous over hydrogen or RP1?